Hey guys, imagine stepping into the Dark Ages, a time when life was harsh, the nights were long, and the flickering light of a torch was your only comfort against the cold and the unknown. Castles loomed over villages, market squares buzzed with gossip, and yet, beneath this seemingly ordinary life, secrets and shadows moved quietly, so quietly that some crimes were never solved, disappearing into history like whispers carried off by the wind. Back then, law and order were fragile, often local lords or town officials trying their best, but justice was inconsistent. A peasant could be accused of stealing a loaf of bread and face brutal punishment, while a noble could commit murder and vanish without consequence. And with no modern forensics, no fingerprints, no DNA, the tiniest clue could be missed, leaving mysteries frozen in time. Imagine someone disappearing one evening, and no one ever knowing what truly happened. That was life in the medieval world, dangerous, unpredictable, and full of secrets. Crime in this era wasn't always sensational, like the stories of daring highwaymen we hear in legends, but it was often chilling in subtle ways. Poisoning, strange disappearances, sudden deaths that everyone whispered about but dared not speak of openly. These were the dark undercurrents beneath the cobblestone streets. Villagers believed in omens, in curses, in spirits. So sometimes the line between a genuine crime and superstition blurred. If a person vanished, the town might say the spirits took them. If someone died suddenly, it could be blamed on witches, or the alignment of the stars, or a rival's dark magic. But even when superstition clouded the explanation, real human malice was often behind it. And it's this mix of the terrifyingly real and the eerily unexplained that makes medieval crimes so fascinating, even centuries later. Even major crimes sometimes went unsolved because of politics. The courts were often tools for the powerful, and if a king or lord wanted a case ignored, it could disappear as easily as smoke in the night. Assassinations were particularly tricky. If someone high-ranking died under suspicious circumstances, no one could investigate freely without risking their life. Records could be destroyed, witnesses intimidated, and rumors were all that survived. Over time, these whispers grew into the legends we now tell as historical mysteries. Some stories may even have been exaggerated or changed to make a point, teach a moral, or entertain listeners around the fire. But the unsettling core, people disappearing, dying mysteriously, or vanishing without a trace, was always real. The Dark Ages were also a period when people lived much closer to death than we do today. Illnesses spread fast, accidents were common, and the tools of violence were simple but effective. A poorly defended village could be raided in the night, leaving bodies, stolen goods, and unanswered questions. Families could disappear overnight, and while disease claimed countless lives, some deaths were just strange. People found themselves in situations that made no sense, or were killed under circumstances no one could explain. In some cases, entire households vanished, leaving neighbors to wonder if they had been taken by marauders, lost at sea, or struck down by some curse. Interestingly, crime was recorded unevenly. Chroniclers focused on the actions of kings and nobles, and towns sometimes kept their own records of fines, thefts, and punishments. But for every record, there were countless incidents that vanished completely. A young woman accused of witchcraft might be executed, her story lost to time. A noble murdered in a castle might be quietly buried, with no official record of who did it. These gaps in history make the Dark Ages an endless puzzle, full of missing pieces, and that's exactly why modern historians, writers, and enthusiasts are still so intrigued by it. Every clue we find is like a tiny flashlight in a very dark room, hinting at a story but never fully revealing it. Some of the most chilling cases weren't in bustling cities but in quiet villages. Imagine a small town with just a few dozen families. Everyone knows everyone, yet someone disappears. The next day, another person vanishes. The villagers talk in hushed tones, blaming strangers who may never have existed, or accusing one another. In a world without effective police, without organized investigation, fear spreads faster than facts, and fear often turned ordinary events into legends. But sometimes, if you dig carefully through the records that remain, you can see the real threads of the story, the disputes, jealousies, secret alliances that led to these unsolved crimes. Then there were murders connected to power and politics. Royal courts were not immune to intrigue. When a high-ranking official or favorite of the king was killed, the culprit often remained hidden, protected by allies. or shielded by complex webs of loyalty and betrayal. Many murders had clear motives, land titles, revenge, but the actual execution and cover-up could be so meticulous that history is left only with questions. Sometimes even the motive was speculative, based on chroniclers' interpretations of events decades later. This makes reading medieval true crime feel like solving a puzzle with half the pieces missing, where the pieces that remain are sometimes deliberately misleading. And then there's the human element, the ordinary criminals, thieves, and murderers. Unlike today, where most crimes are recorded and investigated, medieval justice often punished based on accusation, rumor, or convenience. Some criminals were executed brutally, others quietly released, and many disappeared into history entirely. A single lost ledger, a destroyed court record, or a forgotten witness could erase the entire trail. Every vanished page is a missing piece of someone's life, someone's death, and someone's unsolved crime. In short, the Dark Ages were full of mystery because life itself was unpredictable, often violent, and recorded haphazardly. Crimes that might have been mundane by today's standards, robberies, assaults, poisonings, could become terrifying legends simply because the people of the time couldn't explain them. And the crimes that were deliberately hidden, masked by politics or fear, became the stories that survive today as unsolved medieval mysteries. Over the next chapters, we'll explore some of the most chilling unsolved cases from the medieval period. The mysterious murders in London, vanishing convents, suspicious deaths in castles, and crimes that still baffle historians. Each story will reveal not only the crime itself, but the world in which it happened, the superstitions, the fears, and the fragile justice system of the Dark Ages. Some tales are bloody, some eerie, and some so strange that they could almost be mistaken for fantasy. Yet each is rooted in reality, leaving a haunting footprint on history. So, as you settle in, imagine the torchlight flickering across the walls of a medieval hall, shadows dancing, and whispers echoing in empty corridors. Somewhere in the distance, a crime is happening, and the culprit may never be found. The Dark Ages were a time when mysteries thrived in the gaps between fact and rumor, and in the stories we are about to tell, those gaps remain, chilling and unsolved. In 1327, England was already a kingdom full of whispers and intrigue. King Edward II had a complicated reign, marked by conflicts with nobles and strained loyalties. Among his court, he had a favorite whose influence was both admired and resented. Today, figure whose presence stirred jealousy and suspicion in equal measure. This favorite wasn't just a companion. He wielded real power, shaping decisions and affecting who gained favor in the king's eyes. Such influence was dangerous in a world where power shifted like sand. One evening, the favorite was found dead under circumstances that would baffle investigators for generations. The official account was vague, mentioning illness, but rumors immediately began to swirl. Some whispered of foul play, of political enemies who could no longer tolerate his influence. Others hinted at personal grudges, secret plots hatched in dimly lit corridors of the royal palace. The truth was hidden by layers of deception, and no one could ever say for sure what had happened. Even chroniclers of the time, careful to record events for posterity, could only speculate. The palace was a place of constant tension. Courtiers maneuvered with careful smiles and veiled threats. Any perceived slight could lead to exile, imprisonment, or death. In such an environment, it was easy for a crime to be disguised as natural causes. A sudden illness, a slip of the hand, or a poorly timed fall could all become convenient explanations for a murder. And in the case of Edward II's favorite, every possibility seemed plausible, because every person in the court had both motive and opportunity. What makes this case particularly chilling is the way silence can protect the guilty. Witnesses may have known more than they admitted, either out of fear or loyalty. Some might have even played roles in covering up the truth. Records from the time suggest confusion and contradictory accounts, which only deepen the mystery. And when power is involved, truth often becomes irrelevant. What matters is who survives politically. This means that history often remembers the crime, but not the criminal. Even centuries later, historians debate the events surrounding this death. Some suggest that the king's enemies orchestrated the murder to weaken his position. Others argue that the favorite's own rivals acted independently, seizing a rare chance to strike. Then there are those who think it might have been an unfortunate accident, a sudden illness exploited by those eager to reshape the court. Without concrete evidence, all theories remain speculation. But the intrigue itself is what continues to fascinate. The aftermath was tense. Edward II, already a troubled king, faced not only the loss of someone close to him, but also a court rife with suspicion. Relationships shifted almost overnight. Allies turned into enemies, and alliances were tested. The atmosphere was heavy, and people whispered in corners, always cautious about what they said and to whom. Trust was a dangerous commodity, and anyone could become a suspect simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This case also reveals the limitations of medieval justice. Even in royal circles, where power could theoretically enforce truth, the absence of modern investigative tools made solving crimes incredibly difficult. There were no detectives, no forensics, no reliable way to track suspects or verify alibis. What mattered most was who could control the narrative. And in this case, the narrative was carefully managed, leaving the true story buried beneath layers of rumor and secrecy. The favorite's death became more than just a single crime. It symbolized the instability and danger of medieval courts. It highlighted how ambition, jealousy, and influence could converge to create situations where murder was possible and escape likely. It also showed that even the powerful were vulnerable, because political calculations often outweighed personal loyalty. No one was safe from the consequences of ambition, and those who were closest to power were sometimes the most at risk. It's also worth noting the human side of the story. Behind the political intrigue were real people, friends, family, and servants whose lives were affected by the sudden disappearance. Grief, confusion, and fear filled the palace, and yet, for outsiders, the official explanation was accepted, because questioning authority could be dangerous. This tension between the private tragedy and the public facade is a common thread in many medieval mysteries. It reminds us that crime was never just about the act itself. It was about the ripples it created in a tightly knit and hierarchical society. Interestingly, the favorite's death also sparked stories and legends. People talked about secret tunnels, poisoned wine, and shadowy figures moving through the night. Some chroniclers added dramatic flourishes, imagining plots so elaborate they could belong in a novel. And over time, the line between fact and fiction blurred, as it often does with historical mysteries. What remains undeniable, however, is that someone's life ended abruptly, under circumstances that were never fully explained, and that silence preserved the secret. When we look at this case today, we see more than a murder. We see a glimpse of medieval life. The politics, the fear, the power struggles, all of it paints a vivid picture of a world where danger was constant and justice was fragile. It also reminds us why these unsolved crimes capture the imagination centuries later, because they leave gaps. And in those gaps, the unknown thrives. The questions linger, and the story continues to haunt our understanding of the past. So, as you imagine the flickering torchlight of Edward II's palace, the quiet corridors, and the whispers behind closed doors, remember that not all stories have endings. Some end in questions that echo through history, leaving us to wonder, to speculate, and to feel the chill of unsolved crime. The death of Edward II's favorite is just one of many tales where power, jealousy, and secrecy combined to create a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. London in 1482 was a city of narrow streets, crowded markets, and flickering lanterns. Merchants hustled to sell cloth, spices, and goods from distant lands, while common folk went about their daily lives, wary of thieves and pickpockets. But beneath the clamor of trade and the chatter of taverns, a series of strange and gruesome murders began to unsettle the city. Wealthy merchants were found dead in their homes, often under circumstances so bizarre that neighbors could only whisper about what had happened. The first victim was discovered on a chilly morning. His door was locked from the inside, yet someone or something had broken in and left him dead. The neighbors reported strange noises the night before, faint cries, and the scuffling of boots in the cobblestone alley. Yet when authorities investigated, there were no clues, no footprints, no weapon, no sign of forced entry. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. Panic began to spread among merchants, who realized that anyone could be next, and no amount of wealth or influence could guarantee safety. Over the following weeks, more merchants fell victim. Each murder was stranger than the last. Some were found with signs of struggle. Others appeared as though they had simply collapsed. But the pattern was clear enough to terrify the city. The wealthy were being targeted. People began locking doors during the day, hiring guards, and forming neighborhood watch groups. Yet, despite all precautions, the murderer remained elusive. The inability of the city authorities to catch the culprit only added to the fear and speculation. The investigations were complicated by the social structure of London at the time. Merchants held significant influence, and the authorities were careful not to accuse the wrong person. Everyone had enemies, rival traders, discontented apprentices, jealous neighbors, but proving guilt was nearly impossible. Witnesses were often unreliable, either out of fear of reprisal or loyalty to those involved. And the tools for solving crime were crude. No fingerprints, no systematic questioning, no forensic analysis. A murder could be witnessed by dozens yet remain unsolved because there was no way to connect the pieces reliably. Rumors swirled. Some said it was a single killer. Others claimed a secret society was behind the deaths. Tales spread of masked figures slipping through alleyways, or servants betraying their masters for unknown reasons. The city became a place of suspicion. No one trusted anyone completely. Merchants questioned their partners, wives were wary of their husbands, associates, and even neighbors eyed each other with caution. Fear grew faster than facts, and the line between reality and imagination began to blur. What makes the London merchant murders particularly haunting is the way they highlight the vulnerability of everyday life in medieval cities. Homes were not secure, streets were dark, and the population was dense, making it easy for criminals to operate unnoticed. Even with wealth, the city offered little protection. The fear was not just of death, but of the unknown. Who would strike next, and how? Was it someone within the merchant class, or an outsider lurking in the shadows? The mystery fed anxiety, and anxiety, in turn, fed legends that would last for centuries. The authorities did attempt to investigate, but the results were frustratingly inconclusive. They questioned neighbors, servants, and even family members, yet every lead seemed to dissolve into nothing. Some suspects were accused and then cleared. Others disappeared entirely. The pattern of murders stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving the city to wonder if the killer had died, fled, or simply chosen to vanish. The unresolved nature of the case meant that it lived on in stories, whispered from tavern to tavern, becoming a part of London's dark folklore. Chroniclers of the time described the murders with a mixture of horror and fascination. They emphasized the wealth and prominence of the victims, suggesting that no one, even the richest or most influential, was safe. And while some details may have been exaggerated over time, the essence of the story remained: a series of killings that the city could not explain, leaving fear and uncertainty in its wake. Even centuries later, historians have debated possible motives, suspects, and scenarios, but the truth remains elusive. The murders also reveal the fragility of medieval urban life. A bustling city, full of trade and opportunity, could become a place of terror overnight. Ordinary people could find themselves caught in extraordinary circumstances, and the lack of effective policing meant that justice was often arbitrary or incomplete. Social hierarchies complicated matters further. Accusing the wrong person could lead to political fallout, while the guilty could escape unnoticed. The London merchant murders remind us that fear, more than crime itself, can define an era. The psychological impact on the city was profound. Merchants took fewer risks, traveling less for trade, and the social fabric began to fray. Neighborhoods became insular. People trusted only close family, and superstition grew. Some claimed that curses were at work, that divine punishment had descended upon those who sought wealth at the expense of others. Others feared a demonic presence, a shadowy figure moving silently through the streets. These explanations, however fantastical, reflect the mindset of a society struggling to understand violence it could not control. And yet, for all the fear, the murders also sparked a form of communal resilience. Guilds and merchant associations organized patrols, families looked out for each other, and the city slowly adapted to the threat. While the murderer was never caught, and the precise details of each crime remained lost to history, the response shows how medieval communities navigated danger, blending practical measures with superstition and rumor. The story of the London merchant murders is, therefore, both chilling and enlightening, a window into the fears, limitations, and resilience of people living in the shadow of crime. When we imagine London in 1482, it is not just a city of commerce and opportunity. It is also a city of uncertainty, where wealth offered little protection, and the unknown prowled in the narrow alleys. The murders left a mark on the city's history, a reminder that even in a structured society, the unexpected can strike, and some crimes may remain unsolved forever. And that is what makes these cases so compelling: the combination of mystery, human ambition, fear, and the elusive nature of justice. So, as you picture the fog rolling through the streets, the shutters rattling in the wind, and the quiet tension in merchant homes, remember that this was a world where death could come quietly and disappear without explanation. The London merchant murders remain an enduring mystery, a chilling chapter in the story of medieval crime, and a haunting example of how some crimes are destined to be unsolved. In 1260, in a quiet corner of medieval Europe, a convent stood surrounded by rolling fields and dense forests. Life inside was disciplined and serene, a rhythm of prayer, work, and contemplation. But one night, something strange and unsettling happens, something that would perplex historians for centuries. When the sisters of the convent awoke the next morning, several were missing. Beds were unmade, doors were locked from the inside, and no one could explain where they had gone. The convent was a small, close-knit community. Everyone knew each other's habits, routines, and prayers. For so many to vanish at once was unprecedented. Panic and confusion spread among those who remained. Did they leave willingly? Were they taken by force? Or was there some more sinister force at work? Chroniclers from nearby towns recorded the incident with a mixture of fear and awe, though details were often vague, leaving more questions than answers. Some villagers claimed to have seen strange figures moving through the forest at night. Others spoke of ominous sounds, whispers in the wind, doors creaking, and faint cries. In a time when superstition heavily influenced daily life, it was easy for people to attribute these disappearances to curses or divine punishment. But even with these explanations, the reality remained terrifying. Several women had disappeared without a trace, leaving only uncertainty behind. The authorities investigated, but progress was slow and largely ineffective. Medieval law enforcement was limited, and the remote location of the convent made travel and communication difficult. Search parties were sent, but no clues were found. No trails, no signs of struggle, no evidence of abduction. It was as if the sisters had simply vanished into thin air. And as days turned into weeks, fear transformed into legend. Some whispered that the nuns had been spirited away by supernatural forces. Others believed political or religious rivals had orchestrated their disappearance, though no evidence ever supported these claims. What makes this case so eerie is the combination of routine life and sudden disappearance. The convent was not a site of political intrigue or wealth. It was a humble community devoted to prayer and service. And yet, this ordinary setting became the backdrop for an extraordinary mystery. The fact that so little evidence remained makes the story haunting. Every possible explanation, escape, abduction, murder, or even supernatural intervention remains speculation. And in the absence of answers, the imagination of contemporaries and later historians filled in the gaps. Some historians theorize that the nuns may have fled due to fear or scandal, but there is little to support this. Others suggest a more sinister possibility, that outsiders may have attacked the convent, taking the sisters for reasons unknown. Medieval Europe was a dangerous place, with bandits, rival factions, and political intrigue common even in remote regions. Yet, the idea of an organized attack seems unlikely given the complete absence of evidence. No bodies, no signs of forced entry, nothing that would normally indicate violence. This makes the case one of the most puzzling disappearances of the Middle Ages. The story of the missing nuns also reflects the era's blend of fear, religion, and superstition. People often interpreted the unknown through the lens of divine will or demonic influence. A sudden, inexplicable event like this could easily be seen as a sign of God's wrath, a warning to the faithful, or the work of malevolent spirits. Stories grew in the retelling, becoming more elaborate and eerie. Some accounts describe ghostly figures carrying the sisters away, while others speak of hidden tunnels or secret passages that allowed them to disappear. The truth, however, remains hidden, leaving only the mystery. In addition to the supernatural theories, there were practical ones as well. Could they have been kidnapped by political rivals or greedy landowners? Could rival religious orders have sought to remove them? In a world where religion and power were tightly intertwined, any of these scenarios was possible. Yet, there is no definitive evidence for any of them. Unlike other medieval crimes that left bodies or records behind, the Vanishing Nuns case is marked by an almost eerie absence, a void in the historical record that only deepens the sense of mystery. The human element of this story is also compelling. Imagine the terror of those who remained behind, waking to find their sisters gone. The silence of the empty cells, the unmade beds, the locked doors, all of it would have created an unsettling atmosphere, a sense that something extraordinary and disturbing had occurred. For outsiders visiting the convent in the days that followed, the sight must have been chilling, a visual reminder that the world was full of unknowns. And as word spread to nearby villages, the mystery captured imaginations, becoming a tale told around fires and in quiet whispers, passed down through generations. Interestingly, this disappearance highlights the limitations of medieval investigation. Search efforts were constrained by geography, communication, and the rudimentary methods available. Investigators relied on eyewitness testimony, often unreliable, and physical evidence, which could easily be destroyed or overlooked. In many cases, the truth may have been within reach, but the tools to find it simply did not exist. This inability to solve the mystery contributes to its lasting power, keeping it alive in historical memory as one of the most enigmatic events of the period. The Vanishing Nuns also raises questions about the vulnerability of women in medieval society. Whether the sisters were victims of foul play, coerced to leave, or faced some other danger. Their story underscores how easily women could become invisible in historical records. Their voices were often absent, their fates unrecorded, leaving only fragments for later generations to interpret. This absence of evidence not only mystifies historians, but also adds a layer of poignancy to the tale, a reminder that some stories are lost simply because the people involved had no power to record them. Even centuries later, the Vanishing Nuns continue to fascinate. Historians, writers, and curious minds have pondered the case, offering theories ranging from abduction to voluntary escape to supernatural interference. Each interpretation sheds light not just on the event itself, but on the mindset of medieval society, a world where the boundaries between reality and superstition were often blurred, and where unexplained events could easily become legends. As we imagine the convent in 1260, quiet under the moonlight, with the wind rustling through the surrounding forests and empty cells lying in eerie silence, it becomes clear why this mystery endures. The sisters' fate is unknown, their story unresolved, and their disappearance remains one of the most haunting unsolved cases of the Dark Ages. It reminds us that history is not only about what is recorded, but also about what is missing, about the gaps that invite speculation, fear, and imagination. So, as you picture the empty halls, the quiet echoes of prayers interrupted, and the lingering question of where the sisters went, remember that some mysteries do not have answers. Some crimes, vanishings, and strange events are destined to remain unsolved, preserved in whispers and shadowed corners of history. The Vanishing Nuns of 1260 are one such mystery, a story of fear, uncertainty, and the unknowable that continues to captivate our imagination. Long before the famous Beast of Gévaudan terrorized France in the 18th century, there were earlier lesser-known cases that shook the countryside during the medieval period. In isolated villages, nestled among thick forests and rolling hills, people lived close to nature, but that closeness came with danger. Stories began to circulate of strange attacks on villagers, livestock slaughtered in the night, and shadows moving in the woods where no human should be. One of the earliest accounts describes a series of disappearances in a remote French village. Farmers would wake to find their sheep missing, gates broken, or their dogs found dead. At first, people blamed wolves, which were common and dangerous, or bandits, who might have sneaked into the fields under cover of darkness. But as time went on, the attacks grew more organized and frightening. Some victims were found mutilated in ways that seemed too precise, too deliberate to be the work of ordinary animals. Fear gripped the community. The villagers described seeing a creature that did not resemble any ordinary wolf or dog. It was unusually large, with glowing eyes in the darkness and a ferocity that seemed almost unnatural. People whispered that it was a demon, sent to punish sinners, or a cursed beast born from dark magic. Superstition ran deep in these communities, and every unexplained event became proof of forces beyond human understanding. Yet, behind the fear, there was a very real threat. People were being killed, and no one knew how to stop it. The attacks were erratic. Sometimes they happened near villages, where they could be observed and reported. Other times, travelers along forest paths would vanish, leaving behind only torn clothing or strange footprints in the mud. Children were warned to stay close to home, and adults began to arm themselves with pitchforks, swords, and whatever weapons they had at hand. Nightfall became a time of terror, and entire families slept with fear, pressing against the walls, wondering who or what might come next. The local authorities tried to intervene. Hunts were organized, men armed themselves to track the beast, and traps were set. Yet, the creature remained elusive. No one could predict where it would strike next. The villagers' frustration and panic grew with each passing week. Some began to suspect that the attacks were not the work of a single animal, but of multiple forces, perhaps human accomplices or a pack guided by something sinister. Theories ranged from plausible to fantastical, but none could fully explain the horrors. What makes these precursor cases especially chilling is the combination of human fear and natural threat. Wolves, wild dogs, or unknown predators were real dangers in medieval Europe. Yet the imagination of the people added layers of terror. The unknown amplified their dread. A simple rustle in the trees could be perceived as a deathly threat. Every shadow could conceal the beast, and every missing villager added to the legend that the countryside itself was haunted by something unexplainable. Chroniclers of the period recorded these events in a mixture of fact and folklore. Their accounts often mixed precise details with exaggeration howling that echoed across valleys. Eyes glowing like embers, footprints too large for any natural animal. This blending of reality and myth created stories that could terrify both contemporaries and generations to come. Yet, within these tales, there are clues about the social and environmental pressures of the time: poverty, isolation, the ever-present threat of disease, and the vulnerability of rural communities. That the attacks also reveal something about medieval responses to fear. Villagers relied on community, ritual, and superstition to protect themselves. Priests might bless fields, hunters would patrol the woods, and charms or talismans were worn to ward off evil. But the underlying reality was harsh. These were people trying to survive in a world that offered little protection from the unknown. And when the threat was invisible or inexplicable, fear could become almost as deadly as the predator itself. There were also whispers of human involvement. Some suspected that certain disappearances were actually murders committed by humans, concealed beneath the cover of fear and superstition. In times when law enforcement was weak and communities were isolated, rumors could flourish unchecked. Perhaps some of the attacks attributed to the beast were really the work of someone hiding in plain sight, taking advantage of the panic to cover their crimes. With no modern investigative tools, distinguishing between natural predation, human malice, or supernatural forces was nearly impossible. These early attacks created a template for the infamous Beast of Gavardon centuries later. Fear spread quickly, stories grew taller with each retelling, and the line between human and animal, natural and supernatural, became blurred. Communities learned to live with dread, setting up nightly watches and relying on communal support to protect themselves. And even when the immediate threat passed, the stories lingered, passed down as cautionary tales and whispered legends. What remains fascinating is that even though these early cases were never fully solved, they shaped local culture. Villagers remembered the nights of terror, told tales of the glowing eyes in the forest, and taught their children to respect the wild and fear the darkness. The beast became a symbol of the unknown, the dangers that lurk beyond the safety of the hearth. It also shows how human imagination interacts with real events. When people are confronted with inexplicable violence, myths emerge, often as a way to make sense of the chaos. The Beast of Gavardon precursor cases remind us that history is not just about kings and battles. It is also about ordinary people living with danger, fear, and uncertainty. The deaths, disappearances, and unexplained attacks reveal a world where survival depended on vigilance, courage, and sometimes sheer luck. And because so little concrete evidence survives, the stories remain tantalizingly mysterious, a puzzle that modern historians can study but never fully solve. That as you imagine the forests of medieval France, dark and silent except for the rustle of leaves and the distant howl of wolves, it becomes clear why these early attacks left such an impression. The people who lived through them were not only facing predators, but also navigating a world filled with superstition, rumor, and fear. Every footstep in the woods could be dangerous, every shadow could conceal a threat, and every scream in the night could herald a tragedy that might never be explained. In the end, these precursor cases of the Beast of Gavardin are as much about human psychology as they are about crime or predation. Fear magnifies danger, legend preserves memory, and mystery ensures that the story endures. Centuries later, we still feel the tension and suspense of those nights, and we are drawn into the same chilling uncertainty that gripped villagers long ago. In the shadowed halls of medieval castles, life was never safe, even for the noblest of families. Power, wealth, and influence often bred jealousy, and sometimes that jealousy took the most subtle and insidious form: poison. Unlike a sudden stabbing or a public execution, poisoning was quiet, almost invisible. A cup of wine, a bite of bread, or a spoonful of soup could carry a lethal secret, leaving behind a victim whose death seemed natural at least at first glance. Poisoning was particularly feared because it could strike anywhere. A ruler could be killed in their own dining hall, a rival noble could vanish after a simple meal, and the perpetrator might be someone trusted, someone who prepared food or poured wine. Suspicion became a constant companion. No one could be sure who was loyal and who was hiding deadly intent behind a smile. In a time without modern forensics, determining the cause of death was often impossible. A sudden illness could be labeled as a fever, a curse, or even divine punishment, while the true culprit slipped away unnoticed. One of the most chilling aspects of medieval poisonings was their secrecy. The substances used were often derived from plants, herbs, or minerals, carefully prepared to be untraceable. Arsenic, hemlock, belladonna — these were tools of stealthy murder. A small amount could be fatal, and the effects sometimes mimicked natural disease, making it difficult for witnesses to detect foul play. The cunning required to carry out a poisoning successfully made it a crime both terrifying and fascinating, blending human intellect with deadly intent. Courts of the time were ill-equipped to investigate such deaths. Autopsies were rare, and most relied on observation and testimony, which could be easily manipulated. If a noble died suddenly, accusations might fly based on rumor, envy, or political maneuvering rather than evidence. Families might quietly accuse one another, while advisors and servants were interrogated under threat, often confessing to crimes they did not commit. The truth could be hidden beneath layers of deception, leaving historians centuries later only with speculation and fragmented accounts. Consider a case where a nobleman fell ill after a banquet. His symptoms appeared gradually: nausea, fatigue, a creeping weakness that no doctor could explain. Guests whispered, servants grew anxious, and the victim grew weaker by the day. By the time death came, it was often too late to identify the cause. Suspicion might linger on a rival cousin, a resentful steward, or even the victim's own family. But without proof, justice was rarely served. The perpetrator could vanish into the background, leaving the victim's household to mourn and to fear. Poisoning also served as a tool for political maneuvering. Kings, queens, and ambitious courtiers used it to remove obstacles quietly, avoiding the chaos of open conflict. Unlike a battlefield ambush or a public execution, poison left little trace and little immediate suspicion. In some cases, it was seen as a clever, even honorable way to settle disputes, though for the victim, it was anything but honorable. And because of the secretive nature of these crimes, entire family lines could be affected before anyone realized what had happened. There were also psychological effects that made poisoning uniquely terrifying. Knowing that a friend, advisor, or servant could be the perpetrator created an atmosphere of paranoia. Every meal was a potential threat, every drink a test of trust. Nobles might isolate themselves, guard their food, or rely on personal tasters to detect poison, though even these precautions were not foolproof. The very act of suspicion could poison relationships, sowing distrust and fear in even the most powerful households. Some cases became legends. A queen might be accused of eliminating rivals. A duke might die under mysterious circumstances after attending a feast, and chroniclers would record these events with dramatic detail. Over time, the line between fact and storytelling blurred. These stories, passed down through generations, emphasized the cunning and danger of poison, portraying it as a shadowy weapon that could strike without warning. The suspense of the unknown amplified the fear and fascination surrounding these events. What makes medieval poisonings particularly haunting is their invisibility. Unlike murders with obvious wounds or blood, poisoning left little evidence. Death could appear natural, and by the time symptoms were noticed, it was often too late. Even when suspicions arose, proving them was nearly impossible. Confessions were rare, and courts often relied on superstition, dreams, or forced testimony to fill the gaps. This meant that many poisonings went unsolved, and the perpetrators may have escaped completely, their identities forever hidden in the shadows of history. The victims of poisonings were not limited to nobility. Wealthy merchants, influential clergy, and even ordinary villagers could fall prey. Anywhere envy, ambition, or resentment existed, poison could find a home. Some chroniclers recounted tales of servants who, out of revenge or desperation, secretly laced food or drink. Others described cunning political operatives who eliminated rivals under the guise of hospitality. And because the deaths were often slow and mysterious, the terror lingered longer than a sudden attack, leaving families and communities anxious and suspicious for months or even years afterward. Stories of poisoning also revealed the role of superstition in medieval society. Some believed that a sudden illness was caused by witches or curses, while others thought it divine punishment for sins. These beliefs sometimes guided investigations or distracted them entirely. When no clear evidence existed, fear and rumor filled the void, creating legends that persist to this day. A single death could inspire countless tales, each more elaborate and terrifying than the last, blending real danger with imagination. Ultimately, medieval poisonings were crimes of intellect, patience, and secrecy. They were a weapon of choice for those who wanted to strike without confrontation, and their unsolved nature only deepened the sense of fear surrounding them. The combination of subtlety, inaccessibility to justice, and the haunting uncertainty of the victim's final hours created stories that were as compelling as they were chilling. For centuries, historians and writers have studied these cases, fascinated by the interplay of human ambition, cunning, and the limitations of medieval society. As you imagine a banquet hall in a medieval castle, torches flickering along the stone walls, and nobles raising their cups in celebration, consider the possibility that danger could lurk in the very chalice in your hand. Every sip could conceal a deadly secret. Every bite could be the end of life as you knew it. This invisible threat, hidden in plain sight, made medieval poisonings uniquely terrifying and ensured that these crimes, often unsolved, would live on in stories, legends, and the dark corners of history. In medieval Europe, the line between superstition and crime was often blurred, and nowhere was this more evident than in cases of suspected witchcraft. In villages and towns across the continent, sudden illnesses, unexplained deaths, and failed crops were sometimes blamed on people thought to be in league with dark forces. Those accused were often women, though men were not exempt, and the accusations could arise from jealousy, fear, or simple misunderstanding. One chilling example comes from a small village where multiple deaths occurred in quick succession. Livestock died, children fell ill, and a few villagers succumbed to mysterious fevers. Panic spread like wildfire. The community, desperate for answers, turned to someone they believed had the power to curse or harm. A local woman reputed to possess knowledge of herbs, charms, and spells. Her knowledge, once admired, became the focus of suspicion, and soon she was accused of witchcraft. The process of accusation was as terrifying as the alleged crimes. Witnesses came forward, often under pressure or fear, offering accounts of strange happenings linked to the accused. Objects were interpreted as magical instruments, herbs as poisons, and even ordinary behaviors could be twisted into evidence of malice. Trials, when they occurred, were rarely fair by modern standards. Torture was sometimes employed to extract confessions, and the accused might admit to acts they did not commit, just to end the suffering. Many deaths attributed to witchcraft were never fully explained. Some were likely caused by disease, malnutrition, or accidents. But the human tendency to seek patterns and assign blame turned these tragedies into moral or supernatural narratives. Villagers needed someone to hold responsible, and in a society where the unknown was feared, the accused which became a convenient scapegoat. Whether guilty or innocent, the accused often paid with their lives, leaving the true causes of misfortune unresolved. Suspicion could spread quickly. Neighbors, once friendly, might testify against one another to deflect blame. Family members could be torn apart by fear and accusation. A single unexplained death could escalate into a frenzy, engulfing the community in paranoia. In some cases, entire villages became embroiled in cycles of accusation, torture, and execution, each act feeding the next in a spiral of fear and violence. One particularly haunting account describes a woman, accused after a series of livestock deaths. She was known for her knowledge of herbs and healing. But when the town's crops failed and animals died, she became the target. Neighbors reported seeing her near the barns at odd hours, whispering incantations and handling strange powders. Though these behaviors were likely innocuous, fear transformed them into evidence of dark magic. Eventually, she was tried and executed, yet the livestock continued to die, suggesting that her guilt was imagined rather than real. What makes witchcraft accusations especially unsettling is the role of fear and uncertainty. When events cannot be explained, humans often seek patterns, even if those patterns are false. This psychological instinct can be deadly. In medieval villages, where medical knowledge was limited, natural causes could easily be mistaken for malice or curses, and once suspicion fell on someone, it was nearly impossible to escape, no matter their innocence. Fear could become self-reinforcing, creating a cycle of accusation and death. The impact of these unsolved deaths and accusations extended beyond the individuals directly involved. Entire communities lived under a cloud of suspicion. Markets, gatherings, and festivals were tinged with fear, as people wondered who might be cursed or plotting harm. Children grew up learning to fear neighbors, strangers, and even friends. The social fabric was strained. Trust became scarce, and legend and rumor filled the gaps left by missing explanations. In this way, the fear of witchcraft shaped everyday life in profound and lasting ways. It is also worth noting that not all accused witches were powerless victims. Some were cunning survivors, navigating dangerous social waters to protect themselves. Others were healers, midwives, or herbalists, whose knowledge made them indispensable, yet vulnerable. This duality, power combined with precariousness, meant that accusations could strike anyone, and the true truth behind each suspicious death often remained elusive. History preserves the stories, but rarely the reality. Many cases also highlight the fragility of medieval justice. Trials were often arbitrary, evidence was minimal, and confessions extracted under duress were unreliable. Yet, the consequences were deadly serious. Executions, burnings, or imprisonments left no room for error. Once someone was accused, the likelihood of surviving the ordeal was slim. And for communities, the mystery of continued deaths or misfortune reinforced the belief that witches or curses were at work, perpetuating cycles of fear and punishment. Over time, these stories have taken on a legendary quality. Chroniclers recorded them with dramatic flair, spectral visions, ominous signs, and supernatural retribution. Folklore and historical accounts blended, making it difficult for modern readers to separate fact from embellishment. Yet the underlying truth is clear. Sudden, unexplained deaths in medieval villages often became entangled with superstition, creating unsolved mysteries that haunted communities for generations. In imagining these events, picture the darkened streets of a village at night, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows, and the whispers of neighbors behind shuttered windows. Every cough, every sudden illness, every unexplained death became a potential harbinger of something sinister. Fear was pervasive, shaping behavior, relationships, and social dynamics. And because the true causes of many deaths were never discovered, the terror lingered long after the events themselves. Ultimately, the cases of witchcraft accusations and suspicious deaths remind us that medieval life was filled with uncertainty. When science and medicine could not explain disease or misfortune, people turned to superstition and suspicion. The victims of these unexplained deaths, whether guilty or innocent, became part of a shadowed history, their fates unresolved, their stories chilling reminders of the dangers of fear and the unknown. Even today, the tales of medieval witchcraft capture our imagination. They speak to the universal human experience of fear, the need to find meaning in tragedy, and the tragic consequences of suspicion unchecked by evidence. While we now understand the natural causes behind many of these events, the unsolved mysteries remain compelling, echoing through centuries as a testament to how fear can shape history and human behavior. As you picture a medieval village under the night sky, the wind carrying the sound of distant howls and the faint cries of livestock, consider the fear that gripped these communities. Every sudden death, every unexplained illness, every vanished animal could have been blamed on dark forces, and the accused lived in constant peril. These stories endure not only because of their horror, but because of the mystery that remains unsolved, inviting imagination, reflection, and a shiver in the dark. In the dense forests and winding roads of medieval Europe, travel was never safe. Merchants, pilgrims, and wandering travelers risked more than weather or exhaustion. They risked violent encounters with highwaymen. These bandits operated with cunning and cruelty, striking in remote areas where law enforcement was minimal, and leaving their victims disappeared without a trace. Stories of travelers vanishing overnight became common, and fear of the road grew as much as fear of the dark itself. Highwaymen were opportunistic but also cunning. They studied the routes frequented by merchants carrying coin or goods, and struck where the terrain gave them an advantage: narrow passes, deep forests, or bridges where travelers could not easily escape. Ambushes were swift. A shout, the glint of a sword, or a sudden horseman emerging from shadow could be the last thing a traveler saw, and just as suddenly as they appeared, the highwaymen would vanish, leaving little evidence behind. One chronicler tells of a merchant caravan traveling between two towns. Night fell as the travelers rested at a roadside, and when morning came, several travelers were missing. Horses had been stolen, and the remaining members of the caravan were shaken. No bodies were found, no clues pointed to the attackers, and the innkeeper swore he had seen nothing unusual. Fear spread through the region as rumors grew. Some said the missing travelers had been murdered. Others whispered that they were taken as captives or forced into servitude. Disappearances often occurred in areas where law enforcement was weak or non-existent. In remote stretches, villages were far apart, and sheriffs or constables could not respond quickly. Victims were often discovered days or weeks later, if at all. Some bodies were found in ditches or forests, but many travelers simply vanished. The uncertainty created a heightened sense of dread. Anyone walking the roads could be next, and no one could be entirely sure what had happened. The psychological impact of these crimes was profound. Merchants and pilgrims began to travel in larger groups, hire armed escorts, or avoid certain routes altogether. Fear dictated behavior. Villagers might refuse to offer shelter to strangers, travelers would carry weapons for protection, and families prayed for the safe return of loved ones. Suspicion of strangers, uncertainty about who could be trusted, and the unpredictability of attack became woven into the social fabric. Highwaymen were not always merely robbers. Some were clever strategists who knew how to intimidate communities into submission. They would leave signs of violence or send messages to warn others, creating legends that were as much about psychological control as about material gain. The mixture of real threat and myth amplified the terror, making even safe roads seem perilous. Rumors of entire caravans disappearing or being found mutilated spread quickly, blending fact and exaggeration into stories that chilled communities for generations. Some cases were especially mysterious because travelers were never found. Families waited in vain, villagers searched in vain, and officials could do little. These disappearances became legends in their own right. A merchant might leave for a nearby town and never arrive. A pilgrim might vanish in a forest. The uncertainty, no bodies, no signs, no witnesses, made these cases unsolved and haunting. Communities often created folklore around the missing, attributing their fate to dark spirits, curses, or malevolent bandits with almost supernatural skill. Interestingly, some highwaymen operated with startling precision. They avoided unnecessary attention, struck quickly, and disappeared before help could arrive. This made detection extremely difficult. Villagers could only report the aftermath: missing travelers, abandoned horses, scattered belongings, and terrified witnesses. The combination of cunning criminals and limited medieval investigative methods meant that many disappearances remained unsolved, leaving families and communities with unresolved grief and lingering fear. Chroniclers described these events with a mixture of horror and fascination. They wrote of shadowy figures, sudden attacks, and vanished travelers, often emphasizing the mysterious and inexplicable aspects. These accounts reveal the blend of reality and imagination in medieval storytelling. People sought to explain the unknown, sometimes turning isolated incidents into legends, and over time, the line between historical fact and folklore blurred, leaving modern readers with stories that are both gripping and unsettling. Highwaymen also highlight the vulnerability of ordinary people. Merchants carried goods essential to survival and trade. Pilgrims sought spiritual fulfillment, and travelers simply sought safety or opportunity. None were immune to attack. The roads themselves became a character in these stories, a dark, unpredictable space where danger could strike at any moment. Fear transformed the landscape, making every journey a test of courage, luck, and resourcefulness. some disappearances suggest that more sinister elements were at work. While robbery was often the motive, some travelers were never found, and no loot was ever recovered. Were they murdered for reasons lost to history, abducted for ransom, or forced into servitude in distant lands? The lack of answers only deepens the mystery. Each vanished traveler left behind families, neighbors, and chroniclers struggling to make sense of events that defied explanation. Over time, these tales became part of local legend. Songs, ballads, and oral histories celebrated the cunning of the highwaymen while mourning the victims. Villagers passed down stories of the vanished, warning future generations of the dangers lurking along the roads. These unsolved disappearances, while terrifying at the time, also contributed to a rich tradition of folklore and suspense that continues to captivate imaginations today. The cases of medieval highwaymen and travelers' disappearances remind us that the Dark Ages were not only a time of political intrigue and warfare but also of ordinary peril. Simple acts like walking a road, traveling for trade, or visiting a neighboring village could carry unimaginable risk. And when victims disappeared without a trace, the fear, uncertainty, and mystery endured long after the attacks themselves. Imagine a traveler at dusk, winding along a forest path, the trees casting long, flickering shadows in torchlight, a sudden rustle in the underbrush, the glint of steel, and the knowledge that anyone or anything could strike. The missing travelers became symbols of uncertainty and fear, and the unsolved nature of their fate ensured that these stories would linger for generations. Even today, thinking of these vanished souls sends a chill, reminding us of the perils that were part of daily life in medieval Europe. In the grand halls of medieval castles, beneath the glittering chandeliers and polished armor, a darker game often unfolded, the deadly world of noble feuds. Families who held power, land, or influence were constantly at risk from rivals, distant cousins, and even their own kin. Disputes over inheritance, titles, or marriage alliances could quickly turn deadly, leaving behind a trail of mysterious deaths that were rarely explained. One infamous feud began over a disputed piece of land. Two noble families had lived side by side for generations, each guarding their estates with vigilance and pride. When one family attempted to claim the other's territory through legal or military means, the conflict escalated. Knights were ambushed on quiet roads, servants vanished without explanation, and sudden deaths struck members of both households. Chroniclers of the time noted that some of these deaths were likely poisonings, though proof was scarce. Others might have been orchestrated, murders disguised as accidents. What made these feuds particularly chilling was the unpredictability. A noble could attend a banquet in good health and be dead by morning. Horses might bolt during a hunt, sending riders tumbling fatally. Even carefully secured rooms could become sites of betrayal, with hidden daggers or sabotaged meals. Trust was scarce, and alliances shifted constantly. In this world, family ties were not always a shield, and kinship could be a liability. In many cases, the motives remain unclear. Some deaths may have been driven by revenge, others by ambition, and some simply by paranoia. Chroniclers often report rumors of secret alliances, hidden messages, or clandestine meetings that ended in violence. Yet because records were incomplete, and often biased, historians are left piecing together fragments of stories, unable to determine exactly what happened. The result is a series of unsolved mysteries that reveal both the danger and intrigue of medieval noble life. These deadly feuds were often amplified by the limitations of medieval justice. Kings and courts could be swayed by influence, bribery, or fear. Punishments for murder were not consistently applied, especially if the perpetrator was powerful or well-connected. In some cases, a family might quietly eliminate a rival and leave no record, confident that their status would protect them. This lack of accountability contributed to the mystery, leaving events unresolved and victims' fates ambiguous. One particularly haunting example involved a count whose sudden death was rumored to be the result of poisoning. His heirs disputed the succession, and tensions ran high between branches of the family. Chroniclers noted that the count had dined with relatives shortly before falling ill, but no witnesses reported anything suspicious. By the time he died, speculation about murder, accident, or divine judgment filled the castle. The uncertainty itself became a source of terror, as families questioned whom they could trust, and whether the same fate could befall them next. The psychological impact of these feuds was immense. Noble families lived in constant vigilance, aware that even a trusted relative could be a potential threat. Banquets, hunts, and meetings were not only social events but tests of loyalty and survival. Every conversation, every gesture, and every arrangement could carry hidden meaning. In this environment, fear was woven into daily life, shaping behavior and social dynamics in subtle but persistent ways. What makes unsolved noble feuds particularly compelling is the combination of human ambition and mystery. Unlike highwaymen or highway disappearances, these crimes were often calculated and premeditated, carried out with strategy and precision. Yet despite careful planning, the lack of definitive evidence meant that many murders remained officially unexplained. Families might whisper accusations behind closed doors, chroniclers might speculate endlessly, and future generations would inherit tales of intrigue, betrayal, and unresolved suspicion. These feuds also reveal the fragility of alliances in medieval society. Marriage, friendship, and loyalty were often transactional, easily broken when personal gain was at stake. Betrayal could strike suddenly, and even the most secure castles offered no guarantee of safety. The combination of ambition, secrecy, and limited justice created fertile ground for mystery, ensuring that the details of many deaths would remain forever lost to history. Interestingly, some feuds were resolved, not through reconciliation, but through further bloodshed, creating long-lasting cycles of vengeance. Each act of retaliation added new victims and new mysteries. Chroniclers often recorded these events in dramatic detail, noting the sudden deaths, suspicious accidents, and whispered plots that made the feuds legendary. Over time, the stories became a mixture of history and legend, leaving modern readers to wonder where fact ended and speculation began. Even centuries later, the allure of these unsolved noble conflicts persists. They offer a window into a world where power was precious, life could be fleeting, and trust was a rare commodity. The combination of strategic thinking, hidden malice, and unexplained deaths creates a tapestry of intrigue that fascinates historians and storytellers alike. These feuds are reminders that medieval life, especially among the elite, was as dangerous as it was glamorous. Imagine a grand hall lit by flickering torches, banners hanging from the walls, and the hum of conversation among nobles. Beneath the surface of politeness, there could be plotting, hidden daggers, or poisoned wine. A single misstep or a betrayal could result in death. The uncertainty of who would be next, and the complete lack of resolution in many cases, gives these stories their haunting power. It is a reminder that, for medieval nobility, danger was never far away, and some mysteries remain unsolved for eternity. Ultimately, the unsolved noble feuds of the Middle Ages are more than tales of murder. They are lessons in human ambition, fear, and the limits of justice. They reveal a world where wealth and power could protect only so much, where family ties offered no guarantees, and where the truth could be buried beneath layers of secrecy. The unsolved nature of these cases ensures that they continue to intrigue, frighten, and fascinate, providing a shadowy glimpse into the perilous world of medieval elites. The Black Death and subsequent plague outbreaks cast a shadow over medieval Europe, leaving death and mystery in their wake. While most victims succumbed to disease, some deaths were sudden and suspicious, sparking rumors of foul play. In towns and villages gripped by fear, people searched for explanations beyond contagion, often blaming neighbors, outsiders, or even supernatural forces for the inexplicable losses. During plague years, the sheer speed and unpredictability of death were terrifying. Families could lose multiple members in a matter of days, and entire households might be wiped out before help arrived. In this environment, fear and paranoia thrived. Any unusual death, sudden illness, or strange symptom could spark suspicion. Was it disease, divine punishment, or intentional harm? Without medical knowledge, answers were nearly impossible to come by. Some chroniclers described deaths that did not fit the usual pattern of the plague. A villager might fall ill and die, while another with similar exposure survived. Some were found dead in their beds, their faces twisted in horror, while others disappeared entirely. These cases became fodder for rumor, and in communities already on edge, the unknown could easily be interpreted as murder or witchcraft. Suspicion became as contagious as the disease itself. One unsettling account tells of a merchant found dead in his home during a plague outbreak. He had been isolated, and no one else in the household fell ill. The villagers whispered that he had been poisoned, possibly by a rival hoping to take over his trade. No investigation could prove or disprove the claim, and the merchant's death became one of many unexplained tragedies. Such incidents blurred the line between natural and unnatural death, leaving fear and speculation to dominate. The social impact of these suspicious deaths was profound. Fear of contagion and murder led to isolation, mistrust, and sometimes violence. Neighbors suspected neighbors, families distrusted servants, and accusations could escalate quickly. In some regions, communities turned against marginalized groups, blaming them for the plague or the suspicious deaths, resulting in persecution and death. The lack of evidence and the pervasive uncertainty fueled a cycle of terror and suspicion that could last for years. Plague years also highlight the fragility of medieval justice. Courts were overwhelmed, investigations were limited, and the overwhelming number of deaths made it nearly impossible to determine the cause of every demise. Even when foul play was suspected, the authorities had few tools to intervene. The result was a landscape where unsolved deaths were common, and the uncertainty surrounding them amplified fear. Entire communities lived under a cloud of suspicion, unsure if the next death was natural, accidental, or deliberate. Suspicion during plague outbreaks often targeted those who were already vulnerable. Travelers, strangers, or members of unpopular social classes could be accused of poisoning wells, spreading disease intentionally, or invoking supernatural forces. Some accusations were based on misunderstanding, some on malice, and others on fear. In every case, the truth remained elusive, and the lives of innocent people were often lost. The mix of disease, superstition, and limited justice created a perfect storm for unsolved mysteries. Interestingly, the overlap of natural disease and human suspicion created stories that endure to this day. Chroniclers reported dramatic accounts of sudden deaths, mysterious disappearances, and strange occurrences during plague outbreaks. They described neighbors who vanished without explanation, livestock dying alongside humans, and the eerie silence of abandoned villages. These accounts, while sensationalized in places, reflect the very real fear and uncertainty of the period, leaving modern readers with haunting glimpses of medieval life. Plague-related suspicious deaths also highlight the psychological toll on communities. Fear could change behavior. Families barricaded themselves in homes. Villagers avoided strangers, and even trusted friends could become objects of suspicion. Trust, essential for social cohesion, eroded quickly. People interpreted every unexplained death as a potential crime or curse, and because many victims were buried quickly to prevent the spread of disease, mysteries often went unresolved, leaving stories to fester and legends to grow. In some cases, deaths thought to be suspicious were indeed crimes. Opportunistic individuals may have exploited the chaos of plague years to settle old scores, steal property, or remove rivals. With communities in panic and authorities overwhelmed, murder could go unnoticed, unpunished, and unexplained. Over time, these acts were recorded alongside the natural tragedies of the plague, creating a tapestry of fear, rumor, and mystery that historians still study today. What makes these unsolved plague-related deaths particularly haunting is their unpredictability. Anyone could fall victim at any time. The randomness of the disease combined with human suspicion to create a climate of constant tension. In small villages, every cough, fever, or sudden death sparked questions. Was it the plague, a curse, or deliberate harm? The inability to answer these questions left communities anxious, fearful, and often looking for scapegoats. Despite the terror, communities developed strategies for coping. Isolation, prayer, and rudimentary hygiene measures were employed, but the fear of murder or unexplained death lingered. Chroniclers often wrote of rituals to protect against unseen enemies, charms to ward off disease, and investigations into suspicious deaths, though these rarely produced definitive answers. In this way, superstition and crime intertwined, blurring the line between natural and unnatural causes of death. Even centuries later, these stories remain compelling. They remind us that medieval life was precarious, that fear could magnify danger, and that the line between natural tragedy and human malice was often unclear. The unsolved deaths during plague outbreaks offer insight into the psychology of communities under stress, the limits of medieval knowledge, and the enduring human need to explain the unexplainable. As you imagine a village under the shadow of plague, empty streets, abandoned homes, and quiet fields, consider the fear that gripped its inhabitants. Every knock at the door, every cough, and every sudden death carried weight. Some deaths were caused by disease, some by human hands, and many remain a mystery. The unsolved nature of these tragedies ensured that fear endured, and the stories of vanished villagers, suspicious deaths, and unresolved crimes became part of the haunting legacy of medieval Europe. Medieval Europe was not only dangerous on land, but also on the high seas. Trade routes crisscrossed the coasts and rivers, connecting towns, cities, and kingdoms. But travel by water brought its own perils. Pirates, hostile fleets, and treacherous waters claimed countless lives, and many deaths remained unsolved, shrouded in mystery and fear. Merchants relied on ships to transport goods like spices, cloth, and precious metals. However, vessels were often poorly defended, and crews could be small. Pirates and privateers knew this, striking swiftly along trade routes and disappearing just as quickly. Entire cargoes could vanish overnight, and crews might never be seen again. In these cases, it was unclear whether the missing were victims of piracy, shipwreck, or foul play among their own ranks. Some disappearances were especially mysterious. A ship might leave port fully crewed, sail smoothly for days, and then vanish. Survivors were rare, and the only evidence left behind might be wreckage, floating cargo, or abandoned lifeboats. Chroniclers describe these events with a mixture of horror and fascination, highlighting the unknown fate of sailors and travelers who have ventured into the unpredictable waters of the medieval world. Piracy was often more than simple theft. Pirates could be brutal, murdering entire crews to seize goods and prevent identification. Yet sometimes, the attacks were subtle: a sudden mutiny, a captain found dead under mysterious circumstances, or a ship disappearing without a trace. Rumors spread quickly, often blending fact and legend. In some accounts, pirates were portrayed almost as supernatural forces, striking without warning and vanishing like shadows, leaving communities and traders in terror. One particularly haunting account tells of a merchant vessel sailing from Venice to England. The ship encountered calm seas, fair weather, and no signs of danger. Days later, it failed to arrive at its destination. Weeks of searching produced no clues. Merchants speculated that pirates had seized the vessel, that it had struck hidden rocks, or that the crew had been betrayed from within. No bodies were recovered, and the mystery endured, fueling stories of ghost ships and cursed voyages. Disappearance at sea was compounded by the limitations of medieval navigation and knowledge. Storms, tides, and unseen hazards could easily destroy a vessel, leaving no survivors. Yet the lack of witnesses often gave rise to suspicion. Mutiny, sabotage, or piracy were common explanations when no natural cause could be confirmed. This blend of natural danger and human treachery made maritime travel a breeding ground for unsolved mysteries. The social impact of maritime crimes was profound. Merchants faced financial ruin, families waited endlessly for loved ones who never returned, and coastal communities lived in fear of pirates and raiders. News of disappearances traveled slowly, and the uncertainty surrounding each case left communities anxious. People speculated endlessly, creating legends of phantom ships, cursed cargoes, and vengeful spirits haunting the waves. These stories persist in folklore and literature, capturing the imagination long after the events themselves. In some cases, suspicious deaths occurred not from piracy, but from internal betrayal. Crews could revolt, captains could be overthrown, and rival factions on board could settle scores in secret. The isolated nature of a ship made investigations nearly impossible. A single act of treachery could leave the majority of the crew dead and the vessel lost, with no one left to explain what happened. Over time, these unsolved cases became part of the mystery and danger of medieval maritime life. Shipwrecks added another layer of terror. A storm could strike without warning, sinking a vessel and leaving only fragments behind. Survivors were rare, and bodies often washed ashore far from the site of the disaster. These natural tragedies were frequently interpreted through the lens of human suspicion or superstition. Villagers might claim the ship had been cursed, that rivals had conjured storms, or that the crew had been punished for some hidden sin. In every case, the true story remained elusive. Maritime disappearances also intersected with political intrigue. Kings and merchants sometimes sent ships on secret missions or to transport valuable goods, and the loss of a vessel could have strategic consequences. In these cases, disappearances might be deliberate, sabotage by enemies, betrayal within the crew, or piracy orchestrated to destabilize trade. Again, the combination of limited evidence, treacherous waters, and human cunning made these cases almost impossible to solve. Chroniclers and storytellers of the time heightened the drama of maritime mysteries. Tales of ghost ships, drowned sailors, and unexplained vanishings became popular. Accounts described strange lights on the horizon, phantom sounds from the deep, and ships appearing to vanish in fog or storms. While these stories are often embellished, they reflect the very real dangers and uncertainties of medieval seafaring, capturing both the terror and fascination that surrounded unexplained disappearances at sea. Maritime crimes left communities in a state of constant fear. Families on the coast lived with the knowledge that loved ones might never return. Merchants worried about lost cargo, ruined livelihoods, and the possibility of violence. Villagers speculated endlessly about the fate of missing ships, attributing disappearances to pirates, storms, or curses. The combination of danger, uncertainty, and human malice created enduring mysteries that remain unsolved in historical records. Even today, the unsolved disappearances of medieval ships and sailors continue to captivate historians and storytellers. They remind us that the Middle Ages were a dangerous time, not just on land but also on water. Pirates, storms, mutinies, and sabotage created a world where uncertainty was constant, and the line between natural disaster and deliberate crime was often impossible to discern. Each vanished vessel is a story frozen in time, a mystery waiting in the deep waters of history. Imagine a lone ship on a moonlit sea, sails catching the wind, crew bustling on deck. In the distance, shadows flicker, waves rise unexpectedly, and an unseen threat could strike at any moment. One day the ship might arrive safely, the next, it could vanish without a trace. The uncertainty, the fear, and the unknown make these maritime disappearances some of the most haunting unsolved mysteries of the medieval world. Medieval festivals, fairs, and public gatherings were meant to bring joy, commerce, and community, yet they were also stages for mysterious deaths and unsolved crimes. Crowds, revelry, and sometimes chaos created opportunities for murder, accidents, and disappearances. Chroniclers frequently noted that a single festival could become the scene of tragedy, leaving behind unsolved mysteries that haunted towns for years. Crowded markets and fairs were prime settings for theft and violence. Pickpockets, con artists, and opportunistic thieves thrived in the chaos, sometimes escalating to murder if their schemes were discovered. Travelers attending festivals were vulnerable, especially if they carried money or valuables. When someone disappeared during the festivities, witnesses were often unreliable or terrified to speak, leaving the event shrouded in uncertainty. One example involves a midsummer festival in a bustling market town. Merchants had come from miles around to sell goods, and townspeople had gathered to enjoy music, dancing, and performances. By evening, a young apprentice vanished without a trace. No one reported seeing the disappearance, though rumors circulated of kidnappers or rival merchants seeking revenge. Days later, searches produced nothing. The apprentice's fate remained unsolved, turning a joyful occasion into a cautionary tale. Accidental deaths were also common, but even they could be misinterpreted as intentional. A poorly constructed stage might collapse, or an overenthusiastic crowd could crush a spectator. Chroniclers often blurred the line between accident and crime, leaving future generations uncertain. Was a fatal fall the result of negligence, or had someone tampered with the stage? Did a fire start by accident, or was it arson? The lack of clear evidence ensured that the mystery endured. Public executions and trials could also become deadly spectacles with unexpected outcomes. While intended to demonstrate justice, they sometimes led to mysterious deaths. Condemned prisoners could be killed before their sentence, spectators might be injured or vanish in the chaos, and rumors of poisoning or foul play frequently arose. These incidents blurred the lines between justice and crime, creating unsolved cases that intrigued and terrified communities. Another haunting tale comes from a jousting tournament, where knights competed for honor and glory. During one match, a competitor was found dead in his tent, hours before his scheduled bout. No signs of struggle were evident, and witnesses were puzzled. Some suspected rival knights, others whispered of assassination by envious nobles, and some believed supernatural forces had intervened. The truth was never discovered, leaving a chilling reminder that even celebrated events could conceal danger. The unpredictability of festivals made them fertile ground for mystery. Crowds obscured events. Sounds could be drowned out by music or shouting, and the chaotic environment made investigation difficult. If someone disappeared or was found dead, it was nearly impossible to reconstruct exactly what happened. Chroniclers often relied on hearsay, exaggeration, or rumor, creating accounts that mixed fact, fear, and folklore. Suspicion during festivals often extended beyond direct victims. Villagers might accuse outsiders, wandering performers, or rival towns of foul play. Gossip spread quickly, and accusations sometimes escalated into violence. Marginalized groups such as beggars, traveling merchants, or performers were especially vulnerable, often blamed for mysterious deaths. Even when no one was guilty, fear and superstition could make them targets, adding layers of complexity to unsolved mysteries. Some deaths remained particularly mysterious because they involved subtle or cunning acts. Poisoning, strangulation, or staged accidents could occur unnoticed in the hustle and bustle. A misstep, a brief encounter, or an unnoticed quarrel might result in fatal consequences, yet no one could explain the cause. These unsolved incidents left communities on edge, wary of both strangers and familiar faces alike. The impact of such unsolved mysteries went beyond the immediate victims. Festivals were meant to strengthen social bonds, encourage trade, and celebrate culture. Yet when deaths occurred, the sense of safety and trust eroded. People became cautious, families hesitated to attend events, and the joyous atmosphere was tinged with fear. Over time, the memory of mysterious deaths at festivals shaped local customs and behaviors, sometimes leading to ritual precautions or warnings passed down through generations. Even in hindsight, these festival mysteries captivate historians and storytellers. The combination of human malice, accident, and chance creates compelling narratives that remain unresolved. They offer a glimpse into the chaotic, unpredictable nature of medieval life, where public celebration could suddenly become a stage for tragedy. The unsolved deaths, disappearances, and suspicious accidents remind us that danger lurked even in moments of joy. Chroniclers describe these incidents vividly, often highlighting the contrast between festivity and horror. A bustling fair suddenly silenced by a scream, a cheerful crowd scattering after an unexpected death, or whispers of murder spreading faster than the music. All these details convey the tension between life and death in the medieval imagination. These stories endure because they combine suspense, uncertainty, and human emotion, keeping the mysteries alive across centuries. The cases also revealed the limits of medieval investigative methods. Officials could not always respond effectively to crimes in crowded, chaotic settings. Evidence could be trampled, witnesses distracted or intimidated, and misdirection common. As a result, many deaths remained unsolved, feeding fear and legend alike. Communities often accepted uncertainty as part of life, blending fact with superstition to make sense of tragedy. Ultimately, the mysterious deaths at medieval festivals show that even in moments of collective celebration, danger and mystery were never far away. Crowds, chaos, and opportunity created an environment where accidents, murder, and disappearance could occur with little chance of resolution. The stories of vanished apprentices, poisoned competitors, and unexplained deaths remain a haunting reminder that the Middle Ages were filled with both joy and peril, often inseparably intertwined. Imagine the colorful banners, the sounds of music, laughter, and chatter, and the crowds pressing close together. Amidst this lively scene, a single misstep, a hidden threat, or a deliberate act could change everything. By the next morning, a life might be lost, a person vanished, and no one would ever know the full truth. These unsolved festival mysteries capture both the vibrancy and the danger of medieval life, leaving echoes of fear, curiosity, and unanswered questions that linger even today. Pilgrimages were a cornerstone of medieval religious life. Devout travelers journeyed across dangerous terrain to visit sacred sites, seeking forgiveness, miracles, or spiritual fulfillment. Yet these sacred journeys were not without peril. Along the roads and at holy sites, pilgrims sometimes vanished or died under mysterious circumstances, leaving their fates unresolved and sparking fear, suspicion, and legend. Pilgrims faced a multitude of dangers. Bandits preyed on travelers, especially those carrying valuables donated for religious purposes. Dangerous rivers, steep mountain passes, and treacherous forests claimed countless lives. Illness and fatigue were constant companions, and the isolation of pilgrim routes meant that when someone disappeared, help was often far away. Many vanishings went unexplained, and chroniclers recorded them with a mixture of horror and awe. One striking account tells of a group traveling to Santiago de Compostela. Several pilgrims set out together, but one night, a young man in the group vanished. The companions searched the surrounding woods and riverbanks for days, finding only scattered belongings. Rumors spread that he had been attacked by thieves, kidnapped, or even lured by supernatural forces. No one ever knew for certain. His disappearance became a story whispered among future pilgrims, a cautionary tale of the road's hidden dangers. Suspicion often accompanied these unsolved disappearances. Pilgrims might suspect rivals, fellow travelers, or locals living along the route. Sometimes the fear of divine punishment played a role. An unexplained death could be interpreted as a test of faith or punishment for sin. These interpretations, mingling fear, superstition, and human malice, amplified the sense of mystery and danger surrounding pilgrimages. The isolation of pilgrim routes made investigation difficult. Villages were sparse, inns were limited, and authorities had little power to intervene. If a traveler disappeared between towns, there was often no evidence, no witnesses, and no way to track what had happened. The combination of human threat and natural danger meant that many deaths remained unsolved, leaving families and fellow pilgrims with unanswered questions and lingering anxiety. Mysterious deaths were not limited to the journey itself. At holy sites, pilgrim accommodations were often crowded and unsanitary, and conflicts sometimes arose over resources, lodging, or donations. Chroniclers recount sudden deaths in dormitories, suspicious accidents during religious ceremonies, and vanishings among large crowds of worshippers. Some were likely the result of disease, fatigue, or accident. Yet rumors of foul play often followed, keeping the stories alive as unsolved mysteries. One particularly eerie tale comes from a monastery that served as a stopping point for pilgrims. A young woman disappeared during the night, her belongings neatly packed but her body never found. Monks and villagers searched tirelessly, yet nothing turned up. Some speculated that she had been kidnapped by thieves. Others whispered of spirits protecting the sacred grounds, and a few even suggested divine intervention. Her disappearance became a legend, passed down through generations of pilgrims. The social and psychological effects of these mysteries were profound. Pilgrims traveled in groups for safety, but mistrust could still arise. Fear of bandits, accidents, or unseen threats made even religious devotion a test of courage. Families worried endlessly, and communities along the routes became wary of strangers. These stories highlight the precariousness of medieval life, where even sacred journeys carried hidden dangers, and explanations were often elusive. Interestingly, some disappearances may have had deliberate human causes. Rival pilgrims, opportunistic thieves, or unscrupulous guides might have exploited the isolated conditions of the road. Pilgrimages were long and demanding, and the wealth or valuables carried by travelers made them prime targets. Yet the combination of superstition, fear, and limited evidence ensured that many of these incidents were never solved, leaving an enduring aura of mystery. Chroniclers often emphasized the suspense and danger of pilgrimages. They wrote of travelers lost in forests, sudden illnesses, and strange signs along the route. These accounts blended fact, rumor, and legend, creating narratives that highlighted both the devotion and vulnerability of pilgrims. The stories served as warnings to future travelers and reminders of the uncertainty that accompanied even the most pious endeavors. Some disappearances involved entire groups of pilgrims. Ships carrying travelers across rivers or along coasts sometimes sank in storms, leaving few survivors. Caravan routes through mountains could be blocked by rockslides or avalanches, and bandit attacks could claim multiple lives at once. The scale of these tragedies often made them impossible to investigate fully, contributing to their unsolved status. Communities mourned, speculated, and passed down the stories as cautionary tales. Despite the danger, pilgrimages remained central to medieval spiritual life. People continued to travel long distances, accepting the risks and uncertainties inherent in these journeys. The unsolved deaths and disappearances became part of the lore surrounding the routes, blending fear, reverence, and mystery. Tales of vanished pilgrims reminded communities of the fragility of life, the dangers of the road, and the unknown forces both human and supernatural that could intervene. The enduring fascination with these stories stems from the combination of faith, danger, and unresolved mystery. Pilgrimages were acts of devotion, yet they exposed travelers to threats beyond their control. Sudden disappearances, mysterious deaths, and untraceable tragedies transformed sacred journeys into stories of suspense and fear. Even centuries later, they capture the imagination, offering a glimpse into the precarious, enigmatic, and sometimes deadly world of medieval Europe. Imagine a winding mountain path at dawn, the fog rolling over the hills, pilgrims' prayers blending with the cries of distant animals. Each step carries hope and devotion, but also risk. A figure might vanish behind the mist, a foot might slip on a hidden stone, and the quiet serenity could suddenly be pierced by tragedy. The uncertainty of what lies ahead, the unknown fate of each traveler, and the unsolved disappearances give these medieval pilgrimages their haunting, timeless quality. As we reach the end of our journey through medieval Europe, a pattern emerges. Danger, uncertainty, and mystery were constant companions in the lives of ordinary people and nobles alike. From the darkened forests where travelers vanished, to the grand halls of castles where kin betrayed kin, the Middle Ages were filled with unsolved crimes that left communities haunted and stories untold. Highwaymen roamed the roads, preying on merchants and pilgrims, their attacks swift and often unexplained. Entire caravans could disappear overnight, leaving families searching in vain. Bandits were cunning, their methods precise, and the limited reach of medieval law meant that few were ever caught. The fear they inspired lingered long after the stolen goods were gone, and the uncertainty of who would be next added a shadow to daily life. In noble courts, ambition and betrayal intertwined. Feuds over land, titles, and marriage often ended in death. Yet many of these murders remained unsolved. Poisonings, sudden accidents, and mysterious disappearances were common, and chroniclers documented them with fascination and horror. The very people who were supposed to be safe behind castle walls protected by soldiers and staters often faced threats from within their own families. Trust was scarce, and the unknown motives of powerful relatives left legacies of suspicion that lasted generations. Plagues brought both natural and human mysteries. Illness and death were rampant, yet some fatalities were so sudden or unusual that rumors of foul play spread quickly. Villagers, fearful and desperate, often blamed outsiders, neighbors, or supernatural forces. Suspicious deaths during plague outbreaks show how fear, misunderstanding, and human malice combined to create unsolved mysteries. Even when death was inevitable from disease, the stories surrounding it often took on elements of crime and legend, leaving questions that could never be answered. The seas were equally perilous. Ships carrying goods, pilgrims, and travelers vanished without explanation, victims of pirates, storms, mutiny, or sabotage. The isolation of the oceans and rivers meant that few could testify to what happened. Chroniclers described ghost ships, unexplained disappearances, and mysterious wreckage, blending real danger with folklore. Maritime mysteries remind us that the Middle Ages were not confined to the land. Uncertainty and death followed humanity wherever it traveled. Public gatherings, festivals, and markets were intended for joy, yet they could become scenes of sudden death and disappearance. In crowded spaces, accidents, theft, and murder went unnoticed or unresolved. Chroniclers recounted the chaos of fairs, tournaments, and executions, blending fact and rumor. Even in celebrations, danger lurked. The unsolved tragedies of these gatherings highlight the unpredictability of medieval life, where a festive day could end in horror and lingering questions. Religious pilgrimages, too, were not immune to mystery. Devout travelers faced perilous roads, bandits, accidents, illness, and even potential betrayal by fellow pilgrims. Some disappeared without a trace, leaving companions and families to speculate endlessly. The sacred journey, meant to inspire devotion and provide hope, was fraught with danger, and many pilgrim routes became associated with stories of vanished travelers, unexplained deaths, and unsolved mysteries. Throughout all these cases, one element stands out: the unknown. Whether caused by human malice, natural hazard, or supernatural belief, unsolved deaths created fear, suspense, and caution. Medieval society was built around uncertainty, and communities had to adapt to the ever-present possibility that someone might vanish, die mysteriously, or be betrayed. The chroniclers' stories, blending reality with rumor, ensured that these mysteries endured far beyond the lifetimes of those involved. These unsolved crimes are more than historical curiosities. They reveal human nature, social dynamics, and the fragility of life in the medieval period. They show how fear, ambition, and the unknown shaped communities. They remind us that the past was not just distant dates and grand battles, but also a world where ordinary people navigated perilous roads. Political intrigue, disease, and unpredictable events every day. The mystery and uncertainty were as much a part of life as bread, water, and fire. Even today, these medieval true crime mysteries continue to captivate. Historians, writers, and storytellers explore the vanished travelers, poisoned nobles, and unsolved disappearances for insight, suspense, and reflection. We are drawn to the stories because they echo timeless human fears, the fear of the unknown, the betrayal of trust, and the suddenness of death. They remind us that danger and uncertainty are not unique to our time, and that even centuries ago, life was filled with suspense and unresolved questions. Imagine walking a moonlit forest path, or traveling along a crowded festival street, or boarding a ship bound for distant shores. In every scenario, danger could strike unseen. A highwayman could emerge, a hidden enemy could act, a sudden storm could strike, or a loved one might vanish inexplicably. These unsolved cases remind us that the medieval world, while long past, was filled with suspense, human drama, and mystery. Each story is a thread in the tapestry of history, haunting and unresolved. Ultimately, medieval true crime mysteries are more than just tales of death. They are lessons in human vulnerability, social complexity, and the persistent power of the unknown. They reveal a world where law, protection, and knowledge were limited, and where life could change in an instant. They remind us that history is full of questions that may never be answered. Yet the search for understanding, the fascination with mystery, and the lessons learned continue to resonate. So, as we close the pages of these medieval mysteries, we are left with both intrigue and reflection. The vanished travelers, poisoned nobles, suspicious deaths, and ghostly ships remind us that the Middle Ages were filled with uncertainty. The unresolved nature of these crimes invites our imagination to wander, to ponder what truly happened, and to consider the courage, fear, and resilience of those who lived in a world where danger lurked behind every shadow. Medieval Europe was a place of paradox, beauty and peril, devotion and betrayal, life and sudden death. The unsolved mysteries of the era capture that paradox perfectly. They offer suspense, history, and lessons about the human condition. And even as we lie in the comfort of our modern world, the stories of vanished souls, unpunished crimes, and unresolved events continue to haunt, intrigue, and remind us of a time when the unknown reigned supreme.